Okay, everyone, we have 38 participants, so that's great. Welcome everyone to the Viikki Sustainability Research Seminar, which is a seminar, or we have a seminar series that is hosted by the Helsinki Institute of Sustainability Science, HELSUS, Finnish Environment Institute, SYKE, and Natural Resources Institute Finland, LUKE. And this series has normally been held as a face-to-face event that has also been streamed and recorded onto our Viikki Sustainability Research Seminar Series website, so that you can also look at the presentations afterwards. And this is our first time that we do this through Zoom because of obvious reasons in our special circumstances that we have now. And we are really happy that we are able to host it in a new way. My name is Eva Primer. I am from SYKE, and we rotate these responsibilities of chairing, and our aim is to always have one presenter from each of the institutes, but sometimes we also have outside guests. Today, our topic is sustainable farming systems. We have three great speakers, Heikki Lehtonen, Iryna Herzon, and Tuomas Mattila. We run this meeting so that you can raise your hand, or you can make a question, write your question into the Zoom comment field. Or if you want to comment or make, if your question is sort of broader interest, you can also write your comment or question in Twitter. And if you want to, in general, comment on this seminar in Twitter, we have forgotten to write the hashtag on our opening slide here. So I will just now say the hashtag, but perhaps you find it with this Viikki Sustainability Research Seminar keywords as well. But the hashtag is ViikkiSR altogether. Okay. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who is Heikki Lehtonen, a professor in Natural Resources Institute Finland, LUKE. His topic is sustainable intensification in agriculture, implications for the farm economy and agricultural sector. And I will just say a few words about Heikki. Heikki is specialized in agricultural policy impact analysis using agricultural sector level modeling and farm level modeling, addressing agri-environmental topics such as water protection, biodiversity maintenance, as well as adaptation to climate change and climate change mitigation. So please, Heikki, you can share your presentation and we will listen to you and hopefully have a good dialogue afterwards.
Thank you very much. So I try to share the screen. First, yes, do you see something now?
No. I do not see anything.
You don't see anything? Okay, let's press another.
Looking better now, yeah, looks
good. Okay, very good. Yes, I'm an agricultural economist, so I have been studied applied mathematics, and I have never really studied agriculture, but I'm from a farm originally. And this sustainable intensification in agriculture is something that has been existing always, but it has not been recognized that much until now. I must say that we must first define what is sustainable intensification. It's related to yield gaps, crop yield gaps, so that crop yields could be higher than farmers' yields could be higher than they really receive. And if yield gaps are decreased, then crop yields become higher. And how this is related really to farm economy, how this is related to sustainability. And economy is one aspect of sustainability. And we have a great challenge in agriculture, and that is climate change. And it poses certain challenges and maybe some opportunities for agriculture and for sustainable intensification as well. I approach this by some Finnish examples, and I also tell you some sector level implications, so that what do the farm level issues mean at a larger scale. But okay, sustainable intensification of agriculture is related to climate smart agriculture, which is very much about decreasing greenhouse gases and still increasing resilience of agriculture to climate change and effective adaptation to climate change, so that climate smart agriculture combines already many aspects related to sustainability and climate change. I would say that this sustainable intensification has become much used as a term since the last 10 years. And there are some papers which have been widely cited and mentioned. Some papers find that there must be most likely significant increase in global agricultural production to meet increasing demand. So that how to achieve this without harming environment, how to achieve more food for larger populations all over the world with less environmental impacts. And this is indeed a challenge, even though there are certainly possibilities to increase productivity of agriculture in many places. In almost every country, there can be significant increases in productivity, but how does this happen or realize? With less inputs, so that we produce more with less inputs and harm environment less. And this is not trivial. This is anything but trivial, and this is one topic repeatedly emerging, coming up in the literature. And what does it mean here in the north? So this is not, situations are not the same everywhere, and northern agriculture has some specific issues and problems. But first, I would say that FAO approaches these issues firstly in terms of productivity, agricultural productivity and incomes. Because agriculture is not always a good business. It's a risky business and low income business in many countries. So that first challenge is that how to make poor farmers and farmers who are not doing economically well, how can they respond to climate change problems? Because the problems are often the first ones that farmers experience. And there is a lot of negative experiences of climate change, or even in northern Europe, in northern countries. And if farmers can produce profitably, they have some economic buffer or some capability of adapting to climate change, then they also can remove greenhouse gas emissions, so that productivity is often coupled to less greenhouse gas emissions, at least per unit produced. So these three things come together: productivity and profitability, adaptation and resilience, greenhouse gas emission abatement, towards more sustainable food security. And food security is a big issue because there are a lot of experiences of malnutrition and poverty, even in Europe during the last 100 years. And if people don't have food, they will start moving. They will start doing many things. And one key aspect of sustainable intensification is effectiveness of farming inputs. And in agricultural economics literature, nitrogen response curve is often one, and quite often the only response curve considered. And that has been annoying for me because this is rather trivial or simplistic view on agricultural adjustment if we think only in terms of nitrogen. Certainly nitrogen is a key nutrient for many crops, so that without it nothing really grows, and crop growth often responds quite clearly to nitrogen. And what is often misunderstood in these days is that farmers, they don't really maximize crop yields. So I would say that closing yield gaps, for example, saying that farmers should reach the maximum yield, that is nonsense. It's not rational behavior of a human being to pay something more than it's worth. So that I would say that this is quite fundamental aspect of agricultural change, that inputs are used only up to the level where the inputs give more gain than they cost. And what is interesting is that these response curves are often concave in terms of a functional form, so that when you decrease nitrogen use, you easily get a conclusion that you improve nitrogen use per unit produced. So for example, if you decrease nitrogen close to zero, you still get some yield, yeah, but does it really become more sustainable if you do it? And what is interesting is that different functional forms can be found for this kind of a response function. And there are certain nutrients, not only nitrogen, which provide some response. And in terms of functional form, there are certain inputs like phosphorus, which are shown to increase crop yield up to the certain level. But after certain level, you reach a linear plateau where the crop yield doesn't increase anymore. And then we have the following I would say hypothesis or theorem connected to productivity. It means that there are limiting factors, and they can be many. And when you find the most limiting factor in the soil, in the field, then you can possibly easily increase crop yield. But how to find it? It's not always trivial. So that this kind of thinking and theorizing about limiting factors, minimum factors, it often leads to a conclusion that all farmers should make a soil analysis from every field parcel. And very many farmers don't do exactly that. Yeah, but anyway, this, in economic terms, this provides us a balanced development program of a farm, so that you don't look only nitrogen, you look many other things as well. And here are the yield gaps. So that I would say that the yield potential, what one might get in terms of yields, in the best conditions, in the most favorable conditions, often does not realize in practice. There can be soil and drainage limitations. Yield gap 1 can be already considerable. And the second yield gap is that there is inadequate liming, for example. So this is much the Nordic case. So that in Finnish case, we have a tendency of low pH levels in soil. And liming is one aspect there, one corrective measure. And if farmers neglect liming, they easily get 10 to 15% less yield over time. And the third yield gap might be just inadequate fertilization, crop protection, may be discouraged by policies and markets and risk consideration, so that easily we can find 50% yield gap, which sounds surprising, but I would say that sensible farmers do not try to close this yield gap completely, because it may be more expensive than worth it. Here are some examples about developments of these yield gaps found based on official variety trial data and real data on average yields that farmers are receiving or harvesting. And there are many aspects which drive yield trends over time. Certainly climate change, temperature and precipitation, and certainly adoption of new cultivars. New cultivars come to market almost every year. Fertilization and crop protection issues are certainly influencing yield trends. And all except climate change are affected by markets, prices, policies. And these yield gaps have been rather increasing than decreasing. And we have found some suspects that policy environment in Finland and in quite many EU countries is such that closing yield gaps or decreasing yield gaps is not very much supported by the markets and policies. For example, agri-environmental scheme, it offers farmers some risk-free payment if keeping below certain fertilization limits. And if we consider decreasing real prices of crops, cereals, for example, it's no wonder that farmers do not try to increase yields so desperately, so strong, so that there is some evidence that yield increases have become smaller over the last decades. And maybe this is one hypothesis that agri-environmental scheme is one reason, but there are also other reasons. As I said, these low real prices of food. Yeah, but risk-free payments paid for keeping below certain fertilization levels is one driver there. And interestingly, we have made some model-based analysis of agri-environmental schemes, which have been proved to decrease nitrogen leaching in certain hotspots, so that in areas where possibly there could be incentives for higher fertilization, so the agri-environmental scheme decreases the fertilization and nutrient leaching quite effectively. However, the downside of this kind of risk-free payments per hectare is that more land is kept and maintained in cultivation in order to receive those payments. So there is a scale effect which somehow takes away some part of the leaching reduction achieved in hotspots. And this is one area which has not received very much attention, but I would say it's relevant. And it's part of the OECD studies in analytical terms, but not very much, I would say, evidenced in practice. Okay, climate change. There are certainly challenges of climate change in Finland. I'm not going to details, but I would show you some literature behind, some work behind, so that it's not a trivial problem in Nordic countries. There are all kinds of problems related to crop growth under climate change. However, new crop cultivars better suited to longer growing seasons might be one important way to adapt to climate change, so that longer growing seasons, higher temperature zones, they require different kinds of characteristics of the cultivars. And if developing those cultivars, better yields could be obtained. And we have found some model-based results which support this view that maybe higher yields could be obtained with new cultivars if soils are also in good condition. And on this basis, we have simulated crop yields and farm management using models, where we include not only nitrogen, but also soil improvements like liming, and crop protection actions like fungicide use, and crop protection is also linked to crop rotation. And we assume that monoculture implies gradually decreasing yields, so that we have a model able to calculate and show and replicate actual farm yields. And I show you briefly some results which tell us that in the baseline, climate, no climate change, in North Savo region, we have relatively low barley yields and low production, so that a lot of land is under set aside. And high yields are not really attempted. And also gross margin per farm is relatively low, because gross margin is something that has to be kept also for the fixed costs. So that 10,000 euros per 50 hectare farm is not any good gross margin, so it's very low. But interestingly, we have found that if new cultivars, then farmers have more incentives, more economic gains from fertilization, from liming, from crop rotation, and from crop protection. So that in the end, if farmers are rational, they can manage their farms better with new cultivars. And even in the way that greenhouse gas emissions per unit produced can decrease quite substantially. Yeah, and this can be calculated at different prices, etc. You can have this reference for further information. So I have been working mostly on sector level modeling, and we have calculated also that what this means for the entire agriculture in Finland, this sustainable intensification, for example, with the help of new cultivars and their proper management, where you get more output for the same inputs and you get better economic results. So that we take into account the interactions between scales. So this is not trivial, but Luke has some capacity to do it. So the last slide tells you that probably less farmland is needed if we get higher yields. But then we need less farms, less farmland, and quite a boost possibly to structural change in agriculture. And what are we going to do with the surplus farmland? Maybe they could be used for some environmental purposes, maybe for some other purposes, whatever. And production quantities we have found to be rather stable in Finland, despite this kind of increase in crop productivity and sustainable intensification. So we have found that our production costs in the north are quite high. And even if yields increase, the total production would not most likely increase, maybe little. And this is in fact very much the situation of the European agriculture as a whole. So that, okay, if higher prices, better yields, maybe European agriculture could increase production and exports of food, maybe significantly. But I doubt it, because European agriculture is most often exporting alcoholic beverages, expensive cheese products, and some of value-added products, so that the most of the food needed in developing countries should come from agriculture in those countries themselves. And I would say that what sustainable intensification means for agriculture in the north is somewhat different than in many other countries. So in the north, we are not the first ones to feed the world. Maybe some individual exports can increase, but still they are likely to be high-valued products, while the real solutions must be found in areas where population and food demand is rising. So new kinds of eating or climate-friendly diets are needed, especially in those countries, while they may also give possibilities for neighboring countries to decrease greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So that transition to sustainable agriculture, it requires sustainable intensification and most likely also some diet change. But I would emphasize that in the north, we must find ways to use our land better, because most of the greenhouse gases, they are from the land, maybe 70% or more. So that this is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Heikki. You have got one nice comment in the stream, but now that in the interest of time, I think that we go forward actually to Iryna's presentation next, and then we will see if we have generous time. Coming from forestry, I just say as a comment that there is a big debate in forestry on integration and segregation, whether you produce the sort of sustainability benefits, all the different sustainabilities on the sustainability benefits on the same land, or whether you segregate, and this is very similar line of thinking. Okay, but next we have Iryna. Iryna Herzon is from HELSUS. She's a university lecturer in agroecology and works in the field of sustainable agriculture with an emphasis on ecology and social acceptability of conservation on farmland. And most of her work is multidisciplinary, bridging disciplines across ecology, agronomy, social sciences, and economics. And Heikki said that Heikki is from a farm, Iryna is from a farm as well, and I guess Tuomas is from a farm, and I am from a farm, so this is quite typical in Finland. Do you think, Iryna, that, and Iryna's presentation is about animal-based production, what makes it sustainable? And let us see whether we can share this presentation.
So hello everybody, good afternoon, thank you for having me. So you should be able to see my screen now.
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay. This should be okay, yeah? Shall I?
Yeah, it looks good.
I can start. Good. So thank you, Eva, for presenting me, and thank you, Heikki, for giving such a good ending to your story, because it clicks very nicely into my storyline. So what I would like to do now is not to present specific results from research, but rather to outline what ideas and research we want to make animal-based agricultural production more sustainable than currently is. You probably have been following a rather lively debate in recent years about the role of food derived from animals in agriculture. And we had very heated and polarized opinions. And once the current crisis that we're experiencing now is over, and for sure it is over in time, we'll be back to our very familiar good old crises such as climate disruption and biodiversity loss. And we will be starting to ask such questions once again. So just to remind you the threat, the level of the impact that we are dealing with in relation to animal agriculture, that we shouldn't just neglect the evidence and focus on specific benefits, but we still first need to clearly state that they exist. And this is just one from global overview of over 600 data sets and analysis of all kinds of food items from, again, all over the world, including Finland, comparing the greenhouse gas emissions and land use for different foods. And of course, the range of impacts is very large, from very small to considerable for each of the food items, but the averages nonetheless show us a clear picture that all animal-derived foods, especially for beef here, is many times higher than protein derived from plants. And especially in terms of land use, the difference is 100 times more. And that's just the bottom line we have to work with. And because especially land use impact of animal-based production, we also know that agriculture is the second. This particular picture is produced by Guardian, and it's based on research published a couple of years ago that shows that basically we live currently in the world of domesticated animals. There are more of those than even people, and certainly much more than wild mammals. And though, yes, we know that in Finland that may not hold, but if you calculate the number of animals that live in Finland related to the number of people, then it's just the average for Europe. It's not that Finland really all that different. However, just stating the bottom line, I want to focus on the undeniable benefits of why animals are used in agriculture and probably will be used. And the first, by far the first most important, is the ability of animals to convert those biomasses that are not edible for humans directly into high quality proteins. So ruminants can digest grass and monogastric animals can live on wastes. And also manure from animals is and remains a very important fertilizer for arable land. Because of these just two reasons, that's why humans started to use animals to begin with in agriculture thousands of years ago. Of course, now in more recent historic time, grassland became a very important part of crop rotations in agriculture, and that's due to animals, a lot of it. So there are many agronomic benefits related to having grassland. And in the very recent times, we also started to acknowledge, at least regionally in Europe, that having livestock in particular can support rather unique biodiversity on farmland. Of course, here we neglect the fact that some other biodiversity has been displaced with the arrival of livestock into Europe. So we assigned more value to the species and communities with which we have been living in Europe for thousands of years, rather than those that were lost. And that's different from what is happening in some other parts of the world where agriculture is still encroaching on the native natural vegetation and species. And livelihoods in some region, this is another benefit, and I will come back to it. I hope I will have time to look at it a little bit also. However, these benefits, what is important to realize, these benefits of using animals in agriculture are realized only under certain types of production. So there are some premises that make animals so they're not like immediately realized as a default. And these are at least four, which research have been pointed to. And the first one is that arable land should be used primarily for the production of plant-based food directly to humans, not into the mouths of animals. Then the animals should be fed biomass not suitable for or not wanted by humans, that is grass, that is byproducts or wastes. And these two are again why traditionally animals have been put into use in agriculture, because they were not competing with resources that were able to be used by humans directly, and that changed. Manure again should be used as much as possible for crops for human consumption rather to produce fodder which is going back to animals. And that's what modern agriculture, specialized agriculture usually is doing. Manure is being cycled within the animal producing system rather than being used as an additional benefit for arable cropping. And again, in terms of a very contested issue of extensive low productivity grazing, and contested here, it means that it uses vast areas of land globally and in some regions, that this should be used only when there are clear other values except production of protein. And these values are such as, again, unique biodiversity in some parts of the world, or it could be fire control as it is practiced in some, again, countries such as Mediterranean or the UK. That is, animals are being used to clear out combustible biomass such as bushes around human settlements. Or then in some places, a single goat may mean death or life for the family. So these are really vulnerable populations. As I mentioned, there are quite a bunch of papers being sort of quantifying these sustainability premises for animal production, I rather liked one that was being described already some time ago, but when I reread it again recently, I found it as just as valid. And this is a book by Simon Felley, who wrote, I think, Meat, Benign Extravaganza. So he suggested that we should speak about default livestock as being sustainable livestock. And that means that livestock that doesn't compete for land with humans directly. So here the main sort of criterion is land requirement of livestock. So the lowest competition is with animals that are fed on waste and grazed on rough land, so non-arable land. Then the competition for land increases when the animals are fed byproducts, because byproducts come from produce from the arable land. And then finally it skyrockets when we use animals, when we use grain and other arable products such as soya and etc. for animal fodder. That's where real competition begins, and where the animal production becomes a real issue in terms of sustainability. In more recent days, or more recent years, probably a better term, more easy to understand, has been suggested, for example, by Ellen Roos and her colleagues, of ecological leftovers. That means, again, the livestock and other animals that are being raised in a way that is not competitive with human resources. So this research around many parts of the world helped me and some colleagues of mine to start thinking about the holistic kind of undertaking on the environmental system without having explicit references to economic or social, because as an ecologist, I see the environmental sustainability as a bottom baseline, is a bottom line. If it's realized, then we also can have an economy, but we cannot have economy in a world where environmental sustainability is impossible. So in this framework, the livestock specifically has a number of negative impacts that are, as I referred to already, are undeniable, that are very high greenhouse gas emissions and water use, land area use, and through this also biodiversity impacts. So they're higher than the protein from plant-based diets. And then the problem of nutrient surpluses in some regions with very specialized livestock production or animal production generally. And again, animal welfare issue, even in countries with very strict rules and strict implementation, there are abuses, and they will probably always be. But then there are those positives, which I mentioned. They're listed also here on the right. Of course, very high quality protein, undeniably so, but then those nutrient cycling and maintenance of soil fertility and utilization of non-arable land, so capacity of animals to use areas not possible to use otherwise. Biodiversity and landscape maintenance and tradition. And the last three are such that are dependent almost entirely on grazing pastoral systems. So as soon as you have livestock indoors, you lose all those. What that means is that, and it may sound radical, but the problems that we face, the crises that we are left with, do require for some radical solutions. So we have to redesign the whole system so that they start from this ecological leftover type of thinking. And only then we have enough resources otherwise. So with current highly specialized production that separates animals and crops into different farms and even regions, which is true for Finland just as true for many other parts of the world and European countries. So we should be asking to what extent we can incorporate them back again, so that animal farm also start producing more and more food that goes directly to you, to human mouths. Again, to break down the cycling of manure and and using grassland in crop production only for benefits of animal production. And to what extent we can reintegrate animals into the current arable regions. There is a lot of work now going on such reintegration process in Europe. The issue of grasses, yes, grasses, the ruminants are very important as users of grass biomass, but we shouldn't forget that currently, under our current intensive systems, the grasses are just about 50% of the total forage. So it's not 100 anymore as it used to be. In Europe, even 35 million hectares of land is used for forage cereal crops, and as much is being imported into the continent from other countries. So again, the question could be asked that what ratio of grass versus other forage would be optimal in the diets of ruminants in terms of several benefits and not just one, which is production. So what is currently we're counting of how much liters of milk or kilos of meat we're getting out of unit of forage. And that's too rudimentary, it's too simplistic for the holistic assessment of the use of animals, their additional benefits. The issue of energy is non-trivial because energy in agriculture. And most of it is actually non-renewables. This is petrol and electricity that is being imported. So the question again, how much can be produced based on renewables? Whether we use current technology or some technology that is coming up, what would be the levels of production? And relative benefits of feeding grass to cows versus biodigesters, as it's being proposed quite many occasions now also in Finland. So these are difficult choices. But again, it comes back to the purpose of having agriculture and to purpose having animals in agriculture. It's above all to feed people and feed them with healthy diets. And as we know from so many assessments, at the current rate, we are quite overeating animal-derived products. In Europe overall, it's twice the global average. It's certainly much more than our forefathers used to have in former days. And Finland leads in milk consumption in the world. So how much milk actually people need to be healthy? So the questions here again, to what extent such animal food that is based on ecological leftover principles is sufficient to meet the needs for healthy diets, whether it's in one country or the continent or globally. As Heikki pointed out, it's quite unlikely that Finland will ever be able to feed the world because the food that we produce here is unlikely to reach people who actually need extra animal protein, like Africa. The cost of producing it is far too high in this part of the world. The emissions is a big issue, of course, and what I wanted to point out with these figures, which I'm not going to repeat, is that roughly 60%, even more, of all emissions in agriculture is CO2, which is again derived from the non-renewables that are being pumped from under the ground into the atmosphere. So they're new gases, not part of the historical geological cycle, unlike methane, which is a biogenic gas. And instead of looking at CO2 equivalents from agriculture, we should disentangle these two gases due to their quite different behavior and role in the climate regulation. And finally, food security, and food sufficiency, especially in these days, it's been quite high on the agenda. And it's true that, again, traditionally animals were used in households because they were resources for a rainy day. When crops failed, that's where you culled your pig or a calf to have meat. but not anymore, because the very inputs that come for animal production are largely imports. And there is an unpublished yet study by Lehtonen from Aalto that show that for Finland, it's over 80%. So the whole inputs in agriculture that we are using now, and we are happy, sort of proud to be self-sufficient in food, is actually based on non-self-sufficient imported energy, fertilizer and animal fodder. So what is the true self-sufficiency of animal food from ecological leftovers? How to reach that? And we have seen now disruptions in food markets, but there is no reason to say that the markets in energy will always be stable, or market. Going back to the framework that I already presented. Sorry, I'm waiting, my internet connection is apparently unstable. So going back to this framework, what I see now happening in many countries, including Finland, is running after one single indicator and trying to optimize or trying to minimize that. And this is greenhouse gas emissions. So many producers, retailers, and consumer organizations, and also decision makers are trying to minimize the footprint of food based on this greenhouse gas emission. And that usually leads to intensifying production further. And that, unfortunately, also often leads to minimization and also sacrifice, total sacrifice of all those positives, additional benefits of having animals. Because as soon as you have cow being indoors and being brought the forage from the fields, you lose all other, or most of those other benefits that is arising from the cow. Again, with a very intensive and specialized production, you don't anymore contribute as much to arable cropping and food directly grown to people that is not animal based. So this is rather not helpful in terms of the overall sustainability and the need of having animals to begin with. We need to really strive for multifunctional production, because if we don't do it, we can imagine that maybe not tomorrow, next year, but in 10 years, 20 years, with a very fast developing technology, meat and milk substitutes might just make animal production obsolete as such. They will be much more environmentally efficient to begin with in terms of land area use. They're already overtaking, by far outperforming the animal production. So strategically speaking, like ahead, the animal producers should look at those positives for the society.
Okay.
Okay.
I have a lot to go.
No, if I'm finished on time, because it's difficult for me to follow.
Yeah, we have only 12 minutes, Simon. We have one more presentation left.
Okay, I can stop on this.
Because for those who can afford to stay online, we can afford to have this open for a longer time, but it would be good. Is that okay, Iryna?
I can stop at this.
Great. Just for Tuomas. Thanks. You have got some comments in the stream, and one important one was that you can think about, and we can talk about it then after 4, I would say, is on the land use change, on the connections between deforestation and meat production. So actually converting even more land to animal production. Okay. But I will introduce Tuomas now so that we can go ahead, and those who are busy jumping into a next meeting soon will get to hear Tuomas's presentation. So Tuomas Mattila is also a farmer, and he's a senior researcher at SYKE. His research has focused on modeling of environmental systems ranging from soil processes to Baltic Sea food webs, transport systems, and the Finnish economy as a whole. So he's a broad modeler. He has studied the connections between human activity and the surrounding biosphere and the way decisions are made to manage different ecosystems. And Tuomas will be speaking about soil functions to solve environmental problems. Go ahead, Tuomas, please.
Okay, thank you. we've had a broad interview or a broad introduction to the topic from Heikki and Iryna. Thank you. I'm going to jump to a much smaller question and then maybe back to the larger questions. But the small question, which I think is one of the most important ones for us, is that, let's see if I can change the slide using Zoom. That's the first small question, and the next small question is on the next slide, if I can get there. Yes. So the next small question is, what's wrong with this field? And I've been involved with for the last 5 years or so. And Heikki's presentation on agricultural productivity and improving agricultural productivity is somewhat abstract in relation to problem fields, because this field has had the same amount of inputs, liming and such. And on the right side of the field, the yield of potatoes was 10 tons, and on the left side, it was 30 tons. And the differences are related to soil functions in that field, which is a challenge because it's kind of makes us wonder, what are the soil functions in that field and what's wrong with that field? And if we can answer these kinds of questions in different parts of the world, we can increase productivity quite a bit. How does this relate to the topic of the day, sustainability? Well, sustainability is a bit bigger question than what's wrong with this field. It's a question of what's wrong with this planet. And basically, the most commonly accepted answer to what's wrong with this planet is this spherical diagram looking at ecological thresholds and how far we have exceeded which of them. And if you look at this, you can see that biosphere integrity in terms of species loss and functional loss, which is not yet quantified in this framework, are the highest, followed by nitrogen flows, excess nitrogen flows, phosphorus flows, land system change, and to some extent climate change. And of course, this is one half of the sustainability crisis we're facing, that we're in the middle of ecological overshoot in several life support functions of the biosphere. But the other half is then the social problems. And Kate Raworth has drawn this into a donut in his work on donut economics, where you have the outer shell of the donut is the ecological ceiling with the overshoot, and the inner shell of the donut is the social foundation and how well humanity meets the needs for water, food, health, education, income, etc. And looking at this diagram, of course, there's the question that which ones of these are related to soil? Here's my answer to that question. I tried to be kind of not overly inclusive, because we could say also that education and social equity and political voice could be connected to soil, but these are directly connected to soil. So most of the ecological boundaries we are facing and most of the shortfalls in the social foundation we are facing are somehow connected to soil. And they're not connected to soil as a medium of mineral matter and organic matter, but more they are connected to soil as soil functions. So another diagram. Why is soil so central? The highlighted this by summarizing the soil functions, which have been researched in the literature for decades prior to ecosystem service discussion. So soils provide humanity and the surrounding ecosystem with a lot of different types of functions. Most importantly for us who eat food is the provision of food, fiber, and fuel. Other important functions are, of course, carbon sequestration, water purification, soil contaminant reduction, climate regulation, nutrient cycling, habitat for organisms, and flood regulations. We can think about different agricultural production systems, the amount of animals in them, or the lack of animals in them. But a major component in them is going to be the nutrient cycling capability of the soils. If they fail, or that fails, then we can't achieve nutrient cycling even with livestock. So a few other questions would be that what would the world look like if we would have poor soil function overall? And what would the world look like if we would have good soil function? So I would argue that many of the sustainability crisis aspects that we are facing have a lot to do with poor soil function. And if we could improve the soil functioning globally, we could mitigate many of these problems. Here's just one example from Finland last year. There was a field of field beans which was undersown with cover crops. And this diagram shows the amount of photosynthesis per day, and the right side shows it cumulatively. So by just adding a cover crop undersown with the beans, we could increase the amount of photosynthesis a bit. But of course, looking at the left-hand diagram, we can also see that there's an enormous potential for increasing the photosynthesis during the growing season from both sides of the main crop. Which brings us to this topic that soil functions are very local, as seen in the first slide as well. Some assessments have been made that emissions are mostly coming from only a few % of the total land area, and that land area probably has poor soil function in relation to nutrient cycling, water infiltration, water holding capacity, etc. Just as an example, we have been monitoring now 70 fields in Carbon Action project. It's all open data, can be accessed from that link for checking. But the variation in infiltration capacity of soils and the water storage capacity of soils is enormous. And it's not because of the soil type, but because of the soil management. So we could change this. Some key principles for changing soil functions is to realize that soils, especially agricultural soils, are managed soils, and they are managed by farmers, and they are part of a farm. So the interactions between soils, farmers, farms is critical for improving soil functions, and the realization that these are all individuals, much like soils function at a local individual level, so do the farmers. So management would need to be site-specific. There are some academic disciplines working with this, like whole farm planning, ecological engineering, and sustainable soil management, which provide good frameworks for dealing with the complexities of a whole farm. So an approach for managing soils for better function would be to first check how is the scale of soil quality indicators. Then the second question is, how is the soil functioning based on those quality indicators? Kind of doing an integrative soil health check and identifying also the causes behind those symptoms. And then there's of course the question, how could it be better, and did this work? In Osmo project, we tried this on 8 farms for 4 years and monitored what happened. And few common observation from that is that usually fields have many problems or poor soil functioning across the board. So here's one example of one field at the start of the study. So we had variable and low photosynthesis, poor soil structure, surface bonding, compaction, nutrient deficiencies, excess nutrients, low crop rotation, low earthworms, and we also located a blocked land drain causing waterlogging. So using just one trick or a general approach there would have not helped the soil to work better. And another lesson was that some problems are more common than others. So that diagram is unfortunately here in Finnish, but it can be found in English from that report, and the data is again open access for others, but it highlights the frequency of different problems located from those fields at the start of the experiment and at the end of the experiment after 4 years of different management. And we found that there are a lot of problems in fields. Many of them can be solved. All of them cannot be solved. Usually just solving a few of them will improve soil functioning quite a lot. So now onwards, we are moving on to scaling up this in the carbon action experiment to 108 farms, which are testing now greenhouse gas mitigation through carbon sequestration, changing their management through field-specific, site-specific management plans, and then we have 20 of those sites as intensive sites monitored annually. The rest are on satellite monitoring, and we are trying to get all this data into a field observatory for spring 2020 for everybody to access how are the fields doing, how are they improving, and what's wrong with the fields. I did quite a whirlwind of this topic to get to the end in 2 minutes too late, but thank you anyhow.
Thank you, Tuomas. You started late, so this was great. What a wonderful set of talks discussing very much the same things that you ended with in some way, the growing conditions and what the kind of the capacity of fields, what agricultural areas can produce. We have some discussion here in the chat. That's quite good. And Iryna was asked about the land use change, and someone asked Heikki a little bit about what the incentives of farmers would be. So we do so that now, for those who need to go, thank you very much for joining the Viikki Sustainability Research Seminar. Our next seminar will be on the 28th of April, and it will be on climate change and land use. But if people have now time to stay online, we can continue chatting for a moment. So would you, Iryna, want to comment on the land use change and meat production, or land use change and meat production?
Sorry, I'm looking for that
comment.
That comment.
Well, there was just, so I saw something in Twitter as well, I think, and then Raisa Mäkipää has asked about that deforestation globally is driven by livestock production, and that it's important to find ways to in a way decouple these trends.
Well, I think she comments a perfectly reasonable, in a perfectly reasonable, justified way, indeed. I mean, but I think if we go back to this principle of ecological leftovers as how much food animal-based food we actually need in order to stay healthy and alive, and to grow it in a way that is not competitive with our need for resources such as arable land and other resources, then we also will be avoiding those land use change related emissions and biodiversity loss, etc. You know, this is a very difficult issue to do. What what we have been seeing is the business as usual, more and more food.
Very good. Would you, Heikki, like to comment on the incentives of farmers, how they would react if they were, if their agri-environmental subsidies were cut? The assumptions that you make.
Yeah, so I would say that if the area-based subsidies are decreased, then we most likely have less land area and maybe more safeguard that it will be sustainable intensification and not any intensification. Yeah, but how to keep the land, all land in production, and how to construct new habitat areas so that farmers would be paid for anything else but not much about food production. One can think about it, but really it's problematic for farmers to build their career or their farm development on something else and not on food production. So that food production in any intensification might lead to fewer farms. And if all land is kept somehow as farmland, we really must, then we need to have a lot of money to keep that activity viable. Yeah.
Very good. Okay, does anyone have questions for the, and Tuomas writes, the new CAP renewal is aiming to make the payments more results based, and in some way I agree that maybe this Tuomas's presentation, so if you, Tuomas, want to still comment on how the findings that you have, which are very interesting for anyone interested in sustainability and also on yields, how would those be applicable? How could we really then apply all of that to the broader landscape of farm managed farms?
I think it's a kind of a social challenge also. So I discussed the management unit as that there's a soil and a farmer, but in reality there's a farmer and another farmer and their advisor and some research providing good advice to the advisors. So it kind of needs more emphasis on agricultural extension of research knowledge into the field. And most of the farmers that participated in the OSMO project, I think we had about 600 farmers participating. They always had a team of farmers working on the topic. So kind of that's how you get more people on the ground working with the topic, is that people form groups and get advisors to help them.
Yeah, very good. And do you see that it is the yield that is in some way the main, in a way, incentive or point of entry that you still talk about the soil management and sustainability in soils? Is it yield?
It's I would say yield and also some kind of weatherproofing, in the sense that farmers are really frustrated with problem fields, in the sense that there's the same amount of rainfall on a farm generally, but some fields don't work on wet or dry years, and some fields right next to them work brilliantly. So it's not, it might not make a huge economic bump on the farm, kind of the small problem field, but it's annoying, and it kind of, that starts the process. And usually when you get to the issues that are the most relevant on a problem field, they are like hidden problems all over the place. So like compaction can be critical in one field and it's visible, but that same compaction can cut yields all over the farm, but it's just not visible.
Yes, good. Would anyone else have some comments or questions?
May I have a word, Eva? I raised hand, but you may not see.
Sorry.
What I wanted to add, which I didn't have time during my presentation, is whatever we do should be done in a way that farmers and people who are dependent on those livelihoods, whether it's animal production or some other production, receive a holistic, comprehensive support from the society for the transition. What we shouldn't be doing is putting the blame on certain parts of the society just because they happen to produce something that is not currently regarded sustainable, but rather help people to realize the problem, to realize the issue, to acknowledge it, and then to look for the ways of either changing the production or diversifying, or as Heikki said, some other livelihoods in the countryside. And that's true for whatever, other land use, type of land use, whether it's mining or in Finland, peat mining, and the same for animal production.
Very good. Yeah, sorry, I didn't see the hand. I have so many windows open at the same time. Now, if we aim to finish at 5:15, we would have time for one more question if someone has. I'm thinking from the farmer's viewpoint that, and I'm somehow hearing what Heikki said, that perhaps it will be what the farmers need anyway is if there are these new income opportunities, or if it is something to somehow realign their existing livelihood systems, that they would need some predictability. And perhaps this is what Iryna is meaning as well, that they need some predictability, that there will actually be demand for the thing that they are redesigning their farming system for, so that the policy or societal demand wouldn't fluctuate at a pace that they cannot keep up with.
This is Heikki. May I say a couple of words?
Yeah, please.
I would basically say that there are farmers who are quite ambitious, and they are willing to redesign their farmers. They are trying to produce low carbon food. They are willing to produce more biodiversity. And I would say that they need some longer perspective from the society, so that what is the long-term perspective, what society really prioritizes or considers important. So certainly we have an agri-food system where a lot of investments and debts, so that we cannot change everything overnight, but showing direction for farmers, that what kind of farming is acceptable. That I think will be taken very well by farmers, so that they can consistently then respond more to the societal preferences, and that should of course be EU-wide at least, because we have a common market.
Very good. Well, that's an excellent point to end with. I think that it's a really good final sentence for our successful Viikki Sustainability Research Seminar on this kind of distributed platform. Thank you also to Heidi Blom, who has technically organized this, and thank you to all the speakers who have been flexible enough to replan your week during the last week. We made a lot of replanning, and let us hope we are equally successful in our next seminar that is on the 28th of April. So let's close here, and thank you everyone. We would clap if we were in a real place, in the same place, but thanks a lot.